Honourable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We've got 3 minutes until lunch. I've had quite a lot of coffee from the lovely coffee stand out there, so I suspect I'm going to speak quite fast, but I probably won't be able to speak quite fast enough to get this done in 3 minutes. So please bear with me, and I will try my best to make this interesting. I have in my hand, and you all should have in your lovely packs there, a copy of our Offshore 2020 report. This is some market research that we in oil conduct. This is the 5th year that we've done this research. It's one of the only market research things of its kind. Just by way of background and a bit of a plug as everybody ruffles around for their report. We at Oil, we're the largest global provider of BVI companies. We are also the largest global provider of Seychelles companies, Samoa companies, Anguilla companies, and we have a significant market share in other jurisdictions. And what happened 5 years ago was we looked around at the scene and at the kind of things that were happening in the industry, and we knew what we thought, we knew about people that we spoke to, but there was no market research, there was no data available onto which to base our action points, our strategies, and to see the sorts of trends that we thought were happening in the industry. So we set out to try to change that and to create some market research. Okay, so we're up to sort of 300 respondents for our market research during 2014. As Elise says, and Elise, who I'm rudely standing in front of, was part of our tour. We did this presentation in 9 cities during the course of this year. And that just gives you a breakdown on the sort of people that were assisting us. And many of you in the room responded to the market research as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for being a part of it. And we've already started work on this year's report. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the big picture. I'm going to talk about regulation, tiny bit, because Richard and Ron and others have spoken about that. We're going to look at jurisdictions and how important they are. We're going to look at sources of new business by market, because that's critical about what we're talking about. And then Russell has tasked me with looking at the challenge that comes from jurisdictions like Singapore and Hong Kong, and how the BVI may address those. So I've got 5 points there, because Russell told me he wanted 5 points. So I've got 5 points that we'll talk about, and I'll try to spend a little bit of time about that, but moving pretty quickly through the presentation. And I'll also try to pick up on a couple of points that came out from our previous presentations. So what we did in our market research is we had some questions, and we went to respondents, and the first question was, we understand there's all these macro pressures, the things that Richard and Ron and Broderick have spoken so eloquently about. And the question was, has the range of external macro pressures adversely impacted the demand for offshore companies? That's a key issue. And what we've got there on the top is the 2014 respondents, and on the yellow one is the 2013 respondents. And what people are saying, a minority of people are saying, is that yes, 41% are saying yes, all of these things that are happening in the world has affected negatively the demand for offshore companies. But a small minority, I'll try and point here, a small minority, 52%, are saying actually no, it's not affected the demand for offshore companies, but there is likely to be a shifting of jurisdictions. And we see this reflected in our own portfolio. As I said, we're the largest global provider of BVI companies. For 25 years, our largest product has been a BVI company, and that represented something like 70% of all the companies that we sold globally were BVI companies. And that has shifted considerably since 2013. We're still selling more BVI companies this year than we sold last year, but it's a significantly less higher number in our portfolio. So we've seen this replicated in our own figures, that there has been some switching between jurisdictions. And that picks up from the comments that Richard and Ron made in terms of the future of the jurisdiction. Yes, there is a future for financial services. There's no question about that. It's driven by the global economy, trade, etc. All has to happen. But it's which jurisdictions are going to be winners and losers. So that was the perception. And then we thought, well, that's the perception, but let's look at what the actual figures are. So what we've done here is we've taken 5 major jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions are the BVI, the Seychelles, Cayman Islands, Samoa, and Jersey. There's obviously lots of other jurisdictions, but we've taken those 5 on which we had strong data, and we've added up the number of incorporations that are done there in those 5 jurisdictions combined on an annual basis. And if you look, and this is in the thousands, so from 2011, there were 96,000 companies incorporated in all 5 of those jurisdictions, and the majority of those would be in the BVI. And as we see there, we had to extrapolate out the 2014 figure, and it's pretty accurate based on when we did this and the information that we had. So we've seen there that notwithstanding what people were saying, or 41% of people were saying, actually there has not been a significant drop-off. There is still very strong demand for offshore companies, and these figures have not fallen off the cliff. And that's exceedingly important. Now, the other thing that we would say when we look at these figures is actually we're seeing some plateau. If you look down in 2009 and 2010, and actually if you go back 2004, 2007, you would have seen exponential growth. But you can see here, you can see a definite plateauing. And that's what happens as an industry matures. You'll have during the young phases, you'll have exceptional growth. And then as an industry matures or a particular business matures, you'll have a plateauing off. And as anybody who's read any business textbooks, I haven't, as anybody who's read any business textbooks will know, is there is that point, either you change things up and go on for a phase of new growth, or things start to go down. And I think these are the sorts of things that have driven the government to start looking at various ways of stimulating growth again. So these figures are very interesting. So we have 99,000 there for 2014. Very quick question to the audience. Russell will give you a small prize. How many companies do you think were incorporated in Delaware in 2013? We've got 99,000 combined for the BVI, Seychelles, Cayman Islands, Samoa, and Jersey. How many do we think for Delaware? Richard Hay, you're not allowed to answer. Anybody?
500,000?
No, not that many. Not that many. You are allowed to answer.
2 million in the US.
Well, it's on the active register, yeah, in the US. But Delaware alone was 130,000 companies in 2013. So that gives you an idea of the size of the competition and other jurisdictions that we are looking at. Okay, right. And then we looked at, and this goes back to what Chris was speaking about, and then we looked at media responses, because one of the things that came out of our reports in previous years was the media problem, a PR problem for the industry. So we looked at ways to try to respond to that, and we see between 0 to 5 in terms of what respondents felt was less important or more important. I'm not going to look at this in detail, just to say, obviously, industry professionalism training, lobbying governments and regulators came at the top. I do want to pick up at one point that was made this morning that Chris made about The Guardian and was made about NGOs. The bottom here, people said the least thing that you want to do, it's not a very good sentence, is engage with the NGO sector, that is not going to be efficient or productive in terms of correcting the PR problem that offshore jurisdictions like the BVI had. And what we've been saying throughout our presentations is actually that's the wrong response. I agree with what Chris says, is that we should be engaging with our enemy, talking to them, earning their respect. They're not going to agree with us, but when they understand our arguments and when they look in our eyes and see that these are reputable jurisdictions, this is not, as Richard says, a criminal conspiracy, that will start to change the argument slightly. I've had the fortune through the ISC forum to sit in meetings with some of the NGOs. It can be an exceedingly interesting and enlightening process, and they're not always going to agree with us, but we believe actually that, and I've gone forward somewhere here, we believe that it is important to engage with the NGOs as well. We're not going to talk about the OECD because Richard and Ron have covered that exceptionally well. There were two things happening on this slide, and which is the reason that we put it in the presentation, the kind of full-blown presentation that we've been doing. And one is, are the following likely to happen by 2017? So, for example, publicly available beneficial ownership information, central registry of beneficial ownership, automatic exchange of information. And then the second part of the question was, what is the likely impact on clients' business? And why we thought this was relevant is because the answers that we got in terms of the impact on clients' business. Because actually, the highest one there is 3.7 out of 5. And that, to us, does not speak to the industry believing it would be absolutely disastrous for all those things to happen. So we look back on all the developments that have happened since 1988 and 1999, when the OECD first started its work. And there have been huge changes in our industry during the course of that time. And many, many times people have said, this is the end of the world, this is the end of the industry. But if you look, the industry, as Richard said earlier on, is bigger and better, more robust than it has been at any time. If you'd have told any of us in the industry who worked in the industry, say 10 years ago, and if you said in 2004, by the way, now that you're thinking about your career, just realize 10 years on from now, banking secrecy will be gone. There'll be automatic exchange of information imminent. There'll be public discussions at the highest political level of central registers of beneficial ownership. How are you feeling about your career choice? And I'm sure most of us at that point would have said, I'm going to go and do something else. But guess what? All the financial services businesses are doing pretty well. It's a very competitive market. Businesses are much bigger than they used to be. And so we believe that the industry is stronger and more resilient, and we think that this is demonstrated in this slide. Right, this is one that everybody likes, although we might not like it too much in this room, but there's going to be another slide coming forward. So this is jurisdictional importance. So every year we have a long list of jurisdictions that we have there, and we ask people to respond between 1 to 5, how important those jurisdictions are to you in your business now, and how important you think they're going to be 5 years from now. And what is important about this is a few things. One is which all of the mid-shore jurisdictions, and what we refer to as mid-shore jurisdictions, are places that are not small offshore centers. They're larger countries, and they have some elements of offshore that we would recognize. So they may have a territorial tax system. They may incorporate elements of the offshore industry in their market. So, and we talk about places like Hong Kong and Singapore that I'm going to speak about in more depth, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Ireland, Malta, Cyprus, all of these sorts of places that are starting to compete more and more with the traditional offshore centers. So what's important about this figure is that on this scale, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malta, Ireland, all of the mid-shore jurisdictions are predicted by the respondents to be more important in 5 years' time than they are now. Okay, so that's the mid-shore jurisdictions. Let's look at the pure offshore jurisdictions. What happens there? And when we look at the pure offshore jurisdictions, every single one of those, according to respondents, is anticipated to be less important in 5 years' time than it is now. Elise rightly mentioned earlier on that in our reports that have come out for the last 5 years, that every year the BVI has been the #1 jurisdiction. 5 years ago, when we first did this analysis in Asia, we couldn't even identify the #2 jurisdiction. It was BVI and then a lot of air between the other jurisdictions. Over the next few years, we've seen that in Asia particularly, we have what we refer to as a big 4 of jurisdictions. We have the BVI, Cayman, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And those are the 4 big jurisdictions in Asia that pretty much service everybody from a financial services perspective. So the BVI has remained, and it still is now, #4, it's still the top jurisdiction. But for the last couple of years, all of the offshore jurisdictions are anticipated to be less important than they are now. And again, this goes back to the sort of work that the government's been looking at and the sort of things that are happening within the industry here because of this sort of feeling of respondents. So again, that was the perception. Let's look now at actually what has been happening. And what we have here is we have some results from our 2010 study and we have some results from our 2014 study. And in 2010, for example, the Seychelles at that time was given a 2.1. And people said, 5 years from now, we think it's going to have a 2.5. We think it's going to be that important. And actually, 5 years on, it was around a 2.4. In Singapore, it was a 2.9. And then the market respondents correctly predicted that 5 years on, it would be much further ahead from there. So generally, our respondents have done an excellent job of anticipating which jurisdictions are going to be very, very important. The exception, however, is in relation to the BVI particularly, and also the Cayman Islands. Because what we've seen is for the last couple of years, there has been a substantial anticipated drop-off every year of the BVI in particular. But guess what? From 2010 to 2014, the figures in relation to the BVI have not changed one iota. The BVI perceived to be the most important jurisdiction, and things have not changed there. So that's good news. Obviously, the BVI government took a positive spin off that, as they should do, but we think it's a very important thing. So there is a perception that offshore is going to become less important, but particularly in the case of the BVI and the Cayman Islands, which we think of as quality, well-regulated jurisdictions at the value side of the industry, that has not happened. Okay, right. This is a bit of a change of tack, and we're now looking at where growth in our industry is coming from. So what this is the question to respondents was, where do you, client, business, think that the growth is going to come from over the next 5 years? And no surprise, I'm speaking in this section, and Asia was a clear winner. And again, it's won the last few years, but it's even now more important. Now, the interesting thing about this figure is when we first started doing this survey, our headquarters are in Hong Kong. When we first started doing our survey, most of the respondents were from Asia, and we were accused of having a certain Asia bias. That's fair enough. Now, actually, most of the respondents are now outside Asia. And when we split up the figures and analyze the figures between respondents in Asia and respondents outside Asia, you actually get the same results, if not even more so, that people within Europe and elsewhere are also looking towards Asia for growth. So that just kind of follows up the points that Elise and Jeff have made in terms of the importance of Asia in terms of growth going forward. In this question, you can see a very high bar in the middle, and that one is China. And what we did here is we forced respondents to pick one jurisdiction. So choose one jurisdiction where the majority of growth is going to come from in the next 5 years. And no surprises there. Lo and behold, China is way, way, way out in front in terms of the #1 jurisdiction for growth over the next 5 years. The other thing that we think is very interesting about this slide is that only 3 countries, so these were the top 10 here. So we have the US, UK, UAE, India, China, Russia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia. Only 3 out of these 10 jurisdictions are OECD countries. And of course, we understand that it's OECD countries that are driving the agenda here in terms of the global economy. So we think that that's relevant and interesting. Right, now I think I'm actually going to talk about what Russell asked me to talk about. So we're going to talk here a little bit about opportunities for the BVI. This is not part of the Offshore 2020 report, but this is leveraging off some of those sorts of issues. So we've looked at how we have the big 4 jurisdictions in Asia. We've looked at how Hong Kong and Singapore are perceived to be more important in 5 years' time. BVI and Cayman and other offshore centers are perceived to be less important. So we have this rising challenge of mid-shore jurisdiction. And we don't actually think this is a zero-sum game. We think that within lots of sort of planning and complex corporate and other structures, that there is very often a use for both BVI and other mid-shore jurisdictions. And I'm sure Jeff and other corporate lawyers in the room will see this in terms of their day-to-day work. That there will be a tax element, there will be something, but where there's an SPV required or where there's a holdco somewhere, that's very likely to be a BVI company. So we don't necessarily think that that's a zero-sum game. But we're going to look at 5 points here that I've come up with, and I'll try to make some comments in relation to how the BVI can push back against the challenge of Hong Kong and Singapore. One of them we've already spoken about, I don't need to talk too much more about, and that is the prevalence of BVI in Asia and how important that is for the jurisdiction. The second point is in relation to innovation. Hong Kong and Singapore have changed their corporate and trust legislation in the last couple of years. And there were a lot of private sector people in those markets who were pushing those jurisdictions to change their legislation in a particular way and to be more innovative and to be more aggressive. But those jurisdictions were not prepared to go too far. So for example, within the Hong Kong trust community, people were saying, hey, there's this thing called Vista in the BVI that's been around 10 years now. And we know that it's really good, and we use it in our day-to-day practice. Can we in Hong Kong incorporate some of those elements in our trust legislation? And the Hong Kong government said no. They weren't prepared to do that. And we see similar things happening in lots of other jurisdictions, people that are seeking to compete with the offshore centers, that they will only go so far in terms of where their legislation goes. So what we have here in the BVI and other smaller centers is we have the ability to innovate, and we have the ability to change things. I think Chris said speed of change. We have the ability to innovate, and we have the ability to change things and to be more proactive and to be more aggressive is probably the wrong word in this market, because that sort of reflects aggressive tax avoidance or aggressive tax planning. But we can change things, and we can be more innovative. So for example, the Vista Trust legislation, recent changes to that. And there are lots of other examples of that within our corporate legislation that we want to keep making changes, keep responding to the market. And what that allows is it allows business development professionals to go out there with another story to tell about the BVI. What's another good reason to go back out there? So there are some sort of moves afoot within, obviously, the sort of issues that Broderick was speaking about. Our advice would be innovate, keep innovating, see what works, listen to industry, make changes quickly, and allow the industry to go out and sell those. So we think that is absolutely critical. Just with Ron made the point about the tax thing, I actually made a representation to government a couple of years ago about having an elective, allowing BVI companies to elect to pay some tax. Zero tax is not always a great thing now. Having the ability to pay some tax would work well in certain areas. The third point is regulatory, and I think we have an advantage there. I sit on 8 of our licensed entities around the world, so I'm dealing with 8 regulators on a daily basis. And I can tell you, lots of people say that I criticize the FSC a lot, but I can tell you that most of those jurisdictions around the world would love to have an FSC like we do. They would love to have a Robin Matavius. They would love to have the institution, the resources, and the experience that is within our regulator. And the point is that we also have within the Premier's office and within other institutions here in the BVI, we have a lot of experience dealing with these kind of global standards that are evolving, sitting at the table, making our voice heard. We don't always win, but we do put the BVI case forward. And even large places, BVI, Hong Kong, Singapore, large countries that you would think have experience in those issues, they don't have experience in these issues because they've not done this before. They've not been in this kind of treadmill when they've got the international community, when they've got the OECD coming and making these points. So we have an experience, we have an understanding, we know how these things work. So we do have an advantage there, and I would commend and I would endorse that the government, the FSC, the FIA, all of these bodies continue to work with these regulatory bodies, put the BVI case forward. That doesn't mean that we bend over every time, but it does mean that we put the BVI point of view. So I think that is another opportunity, and there's an advantage that the BVI has over Hong Kong and Singapore in particular, but other jurisdictions as well. Time zone. When we deal with Hong Kong and Singapore, this is often presented as a disadvantage. And I agree. I know I had a video conference at 9 o'clock last night with my boss in Hong Kong, and I had a video conference the night before with someone else in Hong Kong. So believe me, I'm very, very conscious of the time zone. But we can use this to our advantage. We run a 24-hour name check service here in the BVI to work in the Asian day. I know some other people do that, and that is something that we can do. I was asked to sit on a panel in the Cayman Islands, and I was asked to, I think I'd been to Singapore more than anybody else there, and I was asked to represent the Singapore point of view about people moving to Cayman and why they would do that and why they wouldn't do it. And I said to them, is anybody here running a fund administration business and working 24-hour in Cayman Islands? And they all kind of looked at me blankly because no one was doing that, no one was prepared to do it. So there are things that we can do to counter the time zone effects. The other thing that I would say is that it's very often an advantage to us. I had the fortune to go to Samoa a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you know where Samoa is. Samoa is 4 hours ahead of Australia in the time zone. But it used to be on the other side. It used to be behind the US. And because it was closer to Australia, and because they lost working days with Australia and New Zealand, with whom they traded most, they actually flipped their time zone. So they went the other way across the date line. So they used to be behind the US, and then they went to ahead of the US and ahead of Australia. And I remember commenting on that to somebody in Samoa. And I thought, well, that's a really good thing that you guys did. And the guy said, no, this was a corporate service provider in Samoa. He said, no, it was the stupidest thing we ever did. We used to have clients come to us and say, can you incorporate a company yesterday? And they would say, yes, we can incorporate a company yesterday, because they were on yesterday. So it's exactly the same thing that we have here. I promise you that what happens in Hong Kong and Singapore is you have business development professionals running around, having meetings in coffee shops, having meetings all around, all day long. They run around, having lots and lots of meetings. They then go back to their desks at 6 o'clock, and then they send out emails. You guys all get those emails from the people that you deal with in Hong Kong and Singapore. And you then get those emails for them to start work. So then they send you the instructions, and then you have all day to get those instructions done in the BVI. So we actually have an advantage. I know from a geographical perspective, it's a long way away, but we do have an advantage, and it does work very well. I know that the law firms use this, but very often when there's opinion work to be done, you'll start that work. There are lots of BVI lawyers in Hong Kong, in Jersey, in London, all over the world. You'll start that work in Hong Kong, and you actually have a 24-hour working day once you have offices and presence across all of those time zones. So see it as an advantage, don't see it as a disadvantage. And the other thing there is just in terms of quality of life. Hong Kong and Singapore in particular are very, very crowded. They are very, very expensive. It is much more cost efficient to work here in this jurisdiction than it is to work in those jurisdictions. Singapore 5 years ago was not in that situation, but Singapore now is a very, very crowded place. There's a lot of pushback at the social level in terms of more and more people coming in, and there are starting to be social concerns and social issues in those jurisdictions. Just to go back again, think to a point that Broderick made, is that obviously the government has the will to try and make some of these things happen, but looking at people coming here, I would like to see us target, let's pick a number, 25 key professionals. This is a very small market, and I don't think 25 people is going to make a huge impact to the day-to-day social fabric. But 25 of the right people here, in the right fields, properly resourced, can have a significant impact on our industry here. So I commend the government for looking at these issues, and I would say that we do have an opportunity now to make these things happen and to drive the industry forward. And we can do that in small doses without making huge changes to our social fabric, but we can have significant impact with a small number of people. And that can't be done by some of the jurisdictions that we're competing against. So Russell, I hope you're okay with my 5 points that I had there. Just to go back, I've just got last 2 slides. Sorry, everybody. This goes back to the question that Broderick asked his panel. How optimistic or pessimistic is the industry? And I wanted to share this with you. Generally, people are slightly optimistic or very optimistic. There is some pessimism there. It's 16% who are on the pessimism side. Everybody else is either slightly optimistic or very optimistic. So we would say that the glass is half full. That's how we feel about our business. We recognize the challenges and the opportunities ahead, but we are very, very bullish about the industry, and we are very, very bullish about the BVI. And my last slide. So this was where we put out, and if you look at the back of the Offshore 2020 report, you'll see about 15 predictions that we put. So things that we thought might happen by 2020, and we just have 5 here. I don't think we don't need to look too much of these. Consolidation of service providers, better regulated, more transparent, more robust. We think that is absolutely critical. That's where the industry will be in 5 years' time. China, obviously, we've spoken a great deal about that. The big 4 in Asia, we think that that will continue to be the case, but with mid-shore jurisdictions are going to be important, and that is partly because some tax is better than no tax, and that's going to be more of that, and that goes back to possibly having an elective tax rate. And then the last point here is one that Richard made very eloquently about the BVI being an effective and efficient intermediation jurisdiction with global trade. We sit down and we think about what would happen if there weren't jurisdictions like the BVI. My colleague who does this presentation in Hong Kong, he said, well, the chair, the bottle of water, your iPhone, all of those things would be more expensive than they are now. My response to it is, well, if there wasn't a jurisdiction like the BVI, someone would have to invent it, because how else are people doing business across borders? So we think, and again, it's all of our job in here to promote that the BVI and other offshore centers are the jurisdictions, and these are the plumbing that enable globalization. We've had 50 years plus of globalization. I don't think it's going away, and so the BVI has a very important part to play in that. I've overrun horribly. Sorry to keep everybody from their lunch. Thank you very much.